Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, January 28th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the 2024 presidential election and the impact that unenthusiastic Republican voters for Nikki Haley could be the pathway forward for Joe Biden's victory in the 2024 election. Now, this comes after two primary victories for President Donald Trump, with his victory in the Iowa caucus and then his victory in the New Hampshire primary, that have set the stage for consideration about where the voters that were backing Nikki Haley might end up in the general election. And in the state of Iowa, when we saw a huge number of polls coming out of the state that showed Nikki Haley within second or third place, nobody gave much attention to who her voters might support in the eventual general election. It was very clear that for supporters of Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, and many other Republicans, that they would very easily be willing to vote for Donald Trump and wouldn't really have many considerations around it. After all, they practically all represented the same ideology of the Make America Great Again wing of the Republican Party. But Nikki Haley's support is quite different, and none is more exemplified than the polls from the Des Moines Register and other polling sources out of Iowa and New Hampshire that indicate that roughly half of Nikki Haley's support in Iowa and a good chunk in New Hampshire would back President Biden in the general election. And here's why that's a problem. Well, number one, Donald Trump isn't exactly in a position where he has any movement in terms of bargaining power amongst the Republican Party. He needs a full backing of a unified GOP if he is to win this election. Sure, he's up by 4.3% nationwide, but we've been talking about this ceiling that Donald Trump has been reaching quite consistently. Even very few polls actually show him at 50% or more, and the reason for that is because he's averaging around 47% in terms of support. Now, there's no reality in which President Biden does receive just 43% of support. Right now, you're finding that a lot of voters out there, number one, aren't expecting a Trump versus Biden rematch, and number two, on the Democratic side, are upset with President Biden, especially relating to what's happening right now in the Middle East. You find that there's a lot of disillusioned Democrats out there that are refusing to say they would vote for President Biden in the general election, but you are seeing that in some of these polls where President Biden still is losing, it's because of an unenthusiastic Democratic base and not because independent voters aren't moving in favor of President Biden as they did back in 2020. Now, independent voters right now are going to be the key for President Biden to win re-election. I think what we are seeing right now is that President Trump is losing more and more independent voters the more he is out there on the campaign trail on the GOP side. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's leaning into these more extremist ideologies and posting things that are a lot more, outlandish than he did in the last election, which seems quite interesting to say, considering that he completely reworked the way we look at social media and politics and direct-to-voter contact from presidential candidates. But regardless, his movement amongst independent voters has not been moving in a positive direction. And so when we see these numbers out of states like Iowa that show Nikki Haley and a lot of her supporters moving away from backing President Trump in the general election, you start to ask the question, is President Biden's victory going to be reliant on these Nikki Haley supporters? And while I wouldn't go so far as to say explicitly that, if President Biden is to win, a lot of it will be because of unenthusiastic Republican voters and independent voters that might have backed or did back Nikki Haley either in the primary or were going to do it absolutely in the general election, that just couldn't stomach voting for President Trump. Because it's no secret that President Biden is unpopular. There's no real way to explain why President Trump would be able to defeat Joe Biden nationwide. And I think a lot of it has to do, again, people are not happy right now with the Biden administration. The approval ratings at 40%, disapproval ratings at 57%. This would be the biggest political upset in history if Biden is to win re-election in terms of approval alone. Putting everything else into context, it really wouldn't be an upset. But if you look at the approval rating, remember back in 2011 when you saw people reconsidering whether or not President Obama should even be on the ballot for the Democratic Party in 2012 because his approval rating was 45%? President Biden is at 40%, and there is still a pathway forward. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Donald Trump, not Nikki Haley, is his opponent. And I think we really see this fully exemplified in the poll that we just saw from the Washington Post, where, people were questioned about who they would back in a general election matchup between Nikki Haley and Joe Biden, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And you found that, voters weren't exactly super enthusiastic about Trump or Biden, but they were about Nikki Haley. Now, this Wall Street Journal poll is done around 2 months ago, so Nikki Haley was a little bit in better graces with the GOP, but amongst independent voters, you really see that she does very, very well. This is the question that they ask. They pitched up Biden versus DeSantis, who has now dropped out of the race. Of course, Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. We'll start on the Trump side, where they have a question here. If the election was held today, who would you back? And in terms of a definite right now, and a probably, combined vote share here, Donald Trump would still beat Joe Biden in this hypothetical, 47-43. Now, that's a 4-point margin. It's good for Donald Trump, but it's on average with where he is right now. So how much better could Nikki Haley actually be doing? Well, it gets a lot worse for Democrats. In a head-to-head matchup between Nikki Haley and Joe Biden receives just 34% of definite and probable support. Nikki Haley, on the other hand, gets 51%. The difference there? A 17-point gap amongst the same exact electorate that gave Donald Trump a 4-point gap. In terms of DeSantis and Biden, 45-45. It's a tie. Again, the same group of people that are tying with DeSantis, Trump +4, are Nikki Haley +17. And so when I see numbers like that, I think we really are underestimating the electability of Nikki Haley in the general election. I think right now, the enthusiasm is on Donald Trump's side in terms of the Republican Party's voting base. But in terms of what's practical, Nikki Haley absolutely is that. But the reason why you see Nikki Haley seeing a lot of defective support if she does end up losing the nomination is because of metrics like this, where you have around 88% of Nikki Haley supporters in New Hampshire saying they would be dissatisfied if Trump won the nomination. If this was DeSantis, you'd be talking about 15% dissatisfied. If this was Ramaswamy, you would be talking about 5% dissatisfied. But since it's Nikki Haley, who already captures in a group of the electorate that refused to vote for Donald Trump once, you start to see where it starts to crumble. And now that Nikki Haley is polling around 20% nationwide, these are numbers that should be looked at, especially since the RNC recently was considering making Donald Trump the presumptive nominee and then withdrew it after such large backlash from members of their own party, including Donald Trump himself. I think the Republican Party is recognizing the numbers like these in Iowa and the numbers like these in New Hampshire are simply not good enough to move to the general election and be confident about a Trump victory. The longer that Nikki Haley is in the race, the worse Donald Trump's chances get at winning re-election. There is this, seemingly, incorrect take, I would say, and I would argue that there is no impact of this primary on the general election, but honestly, I think there is one. Again, when there is a president this unpopular on every metric, the economy, foreign policy, inflation, crime, immigration, and just general direction of the country, there is no shot they win re-election. But yet in this circumstance, there is. President Biden does have a chance at beating Donald Trump even if he is down by 4.3 nationwide because of who he's faced up against. Because Donald Trump has yet to face the real full impact of the court cases that are coming upon him. Just recently, that civil trial, which he has to pay $80+ million to the defendant there. The plaintiff there. And you also see that as we get closer and closer to Election Day, more court cases, more things outside of this court situation too are going to come to effect. People that weren't enthusiastic about Trump in 2020 may no longer even be considering him at all, right? You find that there is a lead nationwide, but there's a ceiling here for Donald Trump. Biden has room to grow. Trump has never really done better than this. And again, we are in the early stages of this general election. As people who consume this, and as me personally, as someone who creates content like this, we know that it's going to be Trump versus Biden. We knew it a year ago. We practically knew it 3 years ago. But the rest of the country did not. And I keep having to make this point because I think it's really, really important to put things into perspective. Around 30 to 40% of this country doesn't even believe Trump or Biden will be their respective party nominees. And so when you're working in an environment like that, no, the general election has not actually started, which is why Nikki Haley staying in this race is pulling voters away from Donald Trump that eventually helps President Biden. And so when you have nearly half of the Iowa caucus voters here, even in this individual state, that are willing to back Joe Biden in the general election, it calls into question, is Donald Trump truly the most electable Republican? I've argued for a long time the answer is no, and now that it is on the party to decide, I just simply do not think they care. But if you are seeing this level of defection nationwide, 43%, 45% of 19% nationwide is around 1 in 10 registered Republicans. That is not a good look. That is not a good place to be. And when you have the possibility that everything could come crashing down on Donald Trump, and the likelihood of that is honestly hovering around 50-50 by the time we reach the general election. It does call into question, does Donald Trump have what it takes to win the general election? And a map like this, which might seem impossible today, might become our reality in around 11 months. And so I'm at a point where I see these, all these articles coming out about really, upset Nikki Haley voters that are out here saying she's the Republican I really want. 88% of us are going to be dissatisfied. 43% of us are going to shift over to President Biden. I mean, we are at a very strange point here where the Republican primary is very, uncompetitive, but there are still voters here that are unwilling to let up in terms of support for their candidate, even to really no end. I think we are also getting to a point where I'm starting to see similarities, oddly enough, between Donald Trump in 2024 and Hillary Clinton in 2016. I actually saw someone make this take on Twitter that really just jolted my mind here to sort of put it into perspective. It's starting to make a little bit more sense to compare the two. I know it seems quite interesting to sort of put these two together, especially when Donald Trump himself was on the other side of the ballot in 2016. But hear me out for just a moment. When you take a look at the very early primary victories that ended up with a somewhat close primary, but by the end of it, the nominee we knew was going to win ended up winning, an early general election lead that might collapse right in time for the election, scandals that could arise in the late moments of the campaign, except this time scandals are ones that we could absolutely see happening based on a current judicial timeline. I mean, it is all these points that could say right now, today, I believe Donald Trump would win the election. Right? In January 2016, I do believe Hillary Clinton would have also won that election. But as we are getting closer to this general election season, as we are starting to see this delve into a lesser of two evils situation, where now you have Donald Trump facing criminal court cases, I see a reality in which right now these numbers do not pan out to the general election and that Joe Biden wins. In fact, I'd argue that is more likely than not. I think given the current trajectory of the Republican nomination, Donald Trump easily wins that, but he does not easily win the Nikki Haley supporters. He came out on stage in New Hampshire and said, we may not even need these Nikki Haley supporters. When questioned about it again, he said they'll all come crawling back. They always do, essentially taking these votes for granted. And one thing you never want to do as a politician is piss off the voters you need the most. And I would honestly argue that he needs them the most. In 2016, there was this very big effort in the 2016 primary, anti-Trump. It was Rubio, it was Cruz, it was Kasich. It was everyone working in unison to take down the top candidate at the time was President Trump. But by the time we reached the general election, they fell in line. The difference this time is that now Donald Trump has 8 years of baggage, criminal court case proceedings, election overturn history, the January 6th insurrection, consistent losses in 2018, 2020, and 2022, and now really disgruntled Nikki Haley supporters who simply do not want to back him for a third time. This is not the first time we've seen him run, and now it's not the second, and now it's the third. And you are finding him really go down a very interesting path. Truth Social things coming out, the Biden campaign ramping up in full force, the Trump campaign getting on the offense, right? You're seeing it really come to build this perfect storm, a perfect storm that led Democrats to victory in 2022, that led Democrats to victory in 2020, that led them to victory in 2018. And it seems pretty consistent here that what Democrats need to happen for a Biden victory, despite his low level of approval, is starting to take place. And I think it really starts at the GOP primary, which is why I think they are very happy, they being the Democrats, are very happy that this primary is being prolonged, because all it means is that there will be more upset Haley voters that could be willing to back President Biden, especially if this amount of them are dissatisfied with Trump winning the nomination. And so when we see the primary come to a conclusion, we will truly see the impact of Nikki Haley's candidacy and whether or not they would be willing to even listen to her if she eventually endorses Donald Trump, which I entirely expect her to do. It's an interesting race out here. Very upset party lines, very upset general election voters too. I think we are getting to a point where this election matchup could be equally the most interesting and most boring election of our lifetimes. A rematch that was always meant to be, but one that I think nobody really wanted on the general election front. I think Donald Trump coming back into the presidential race might have shocked some people. I don't think it shocked any of us watching this, especially when he announced in November of 2022. It'll be very interesting to see what Donald Trump is set to do and whether or not he wins the election, with or without these supporters, as he says he can do easily without them, or that they'll all come crawling back, but the numbers simply don't seem to back that. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below, subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.